Before I screw up your name too bad, is it Mitenbuler?
Yeah, it's Mitenbuler. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, I didn't screw it up too bad then.
Nice.
No, not at all, actually.
First try.
Guys, we got to stop. I totally forgot to hit the record button. How embarrassing is that? Okay, I'm going to cut that. I'm going to start that over again. On this episode, we are joined by Reid Mitenbuler, author of the book Bourbon Empire, as we discuss the history and psyche behind bourbon, a distinctive product of the United States. And we're back with another episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast. My name is Kenny, and we've got Ryan here today as well. Ryan, you doing all right?
Doing good, man. We're grinding. You know, was this our third episode this week we've recorded?
We're killing it. We are killing it right now.
Back at it, making up for all that lost time. But no, I'm doing great, man. I'm really pumped for today's show. We love bourbon because it tastes good, and as you know, with the episode about aroma, guys, because it smells good, but we also love it because of the history and the stories, you know, especially being from Kentucky. Like, I really resonate with the brands and the stories behind them, whether they're true or false. But, I'm really excited to dive into today's show and kind of talk about that history a little more.
Me too. I was like sort of prepping myself for today's show. And if anybody's like planning a trip to Louisville here within the holiday season, if you want to, there is a pre-Prohibition exhibit at the Fraser Museum. The Fraser Museum's kind of a history museum around us, and there's a whole exhibit for Prohibition, and you can go there, and it talks about some of the ladies who are against Prohibition. If you actually follow us on Twitter, I was Instagramming a few of those photos from there, so you can kind of see sort of the history of what it took for those. You could call them the dark times of America's history without booze, but it was very interesting. And we always talk about, as you said, the taste, the smell, the nature of it. But there's such a rich history in what bourbon is. There's a rich history with family lineages of things trading between companies and all this other sort of stuff. So yeah, you're totally right. Super excited to have on our guest today. So.
With the Fraser Museum, I did read yesterday in the Courier they partnered with the Kentucky Distiller Association, and instead of changing the exhibits all the time, it's going to maintain that they're going to continue to do bourbon themed exhibits, and it's going to actually be the start of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, to where people coming to Louisville go there and then go from distilleries from there. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That is awesome. I think
it was in yesterday's Courier, so I thought that was pretty cool.
Man, you still read the newspaper?
Well, I go to Saints. It's a bar, my local watering hole, and they have it there, and that's the only time I read
it. There you go. I don't call you old just yet then.
Yep, exactly.
All right, so I'll go ahead and we'll introduce our guest. So I'll go ahead and introduce our guest. Today we have on the show Reid Mitenbuler. Reid is the author of the book Bourbon Empire. So Reid, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So Reid, before we jump into the book and start talking about it, and I love the prologue. I was actually able to read it this week prepping for the show. Tell us your coming of age tale to bourbon. Like, how'd you get into bourbon and whiskey, and what made you so fascinated with it that you just happened to become an author on the subject?
Yeah, I graduated college in 2000, and so it was right about that point I became a whiskey geek. I was actually in the military. I had done ROTC in college, and after work on Fridays, we would go to the officers club, and there, play pool and that kind of stuff. And I hadn't been a big drinker in college, but everyone kind of had something in their hand. A lot of guys had done time in Germany. So they're big beer geeks, and whiskey wasn't that popular. That was still sort of when it was seen as a little bit of an old man's drink, and something about it was just kind of appealing. So that was really the big start for it. And it was nothing fancy or expensive, and I realized I liked it. It was a really good deal. It was always sort of like this cheap thing at the bar that was good. So that's kind of how it began, and then like anything you geek out about, it kind of began from there. I started, buying different bottles, and it was a mix of all kinds of whiskey, scotch, bourbon, whatever. But
so you've been at it for a few years then.
Yeah, I started getting into it. You start reading more about it. You want to learn more about it. You start looking for books about it, and that's how it, kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, I guess kind of talk about that. What was the the culmination or the want to write a book about it when there are already some authors out there already?
Yeah, well, when I started writing this book or thinking about writing this book, it was over 10 years ago, and it was because I was looking for more information on what was still kind of a niche thing. There were a few blogs and there were a few guides, and the guides would have some history sections in the beginning, kind of thin. Chuck Cowdery's book had just come out at one point. I remember reading that, and I was curious to keep learning more. And I realized how great this story was, especially when you look at it in terms of symbols. Everyone has that nickname as America's native spirit, which is a kind of a misquote of the 1964 resolution, a distinctive product of the United States.
And I want you to talk about that real quick, because I found that super interesting when I was reading about that. Just go ahead and kind of give everybody a quick rundown of why that's a misquote.
Yeah, well, when Congress declared a distinctive product of the United States, it was to give it a kind of trade protection in overseas markets so that you couldn't have foreign producers making something called bourbon. And this is something that was lobbied for by the industry at the time to sort of protect themselves a little bit and, reduce their competition. The same way that you have these controls for champagne or tequila or what have you. And, this bill was lobbied for, and today it's been sort of reimagined as a kind of, a Valentine's Day given to the Valentine's Day card, given to the industry by Congress, for American heritage and that kind of thing. The reality was really it was much more of a business measure, and I liked watching how if you repeat the myth enough times, the myth becomes reality, right? Everyone's like, oh, it's America's native spirit. And the resolution never really used that language. It wasn't as heartwarming as that language would suggest. And that in itself is a very American kind of story, how we reimagine the past. And I was looking at the history of this product, and it really is a history of American capitalism in a lot of ways when you break it down as a symbol. You've got the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s, which is this battle between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And that might be kind of a simplification, but it's a battle between their dueling philosophies to define the soul of American business. And then as you go through the history of the United States, you kind of see whiskey having an influence on politics and economics, and then vice versa. You see how as the nation is evolving and becoming more industrial, the product itself is changing. So it's a push and a pull. And I was like, what if we break it down and we look at the history of this product as a miniature version of the history as the country that it comes from, in all these different aspects, economics, politics, lobbying. What we hold in our hand today, that product is the result of all those things. And so I tried to break the history down that way. I think it's a really great story, and that's a book I really wanted to read, and I realized it didn't totally exist. So I just kind of started tinkering, putting it together, mapping it out, that sort of thing. And that's how the book came about.
Yeah, and I think we've always know that it's really hard to take a lot of history and make it into a story. So let's kind of talk about the story, right? I want to talk about the beginning, because there's something. The first title or the first chapter of the book is called "The Big Bang." So kind of talk about the beginning where you mentioned the Big Bang of bourbon.
Yeah. So in the history of bourbon, history of American whiskey, you've had a number of producers sort of for marketing purposes try to lay it down to a single individual, the hero of our story, be it Elijah Craig or an Evan Williams type character or whatever. There really is no, creator of bourbon or anything like that. So how did this product evolve? And in a lot of ways, it was a lot of people doing a lot of different things. Best practices get transferred by word of mouth, and that's how it kind of was. So there really isn't a patch of ground that you can stick a flag in and say, like, this is where it all began, or this, whatever. But there was a story that I'd come across in a number of old books about, George Thorpe, who had come over and, in the 1600s, and he lived at a place just up the river from Jamestown. And this guy didn't create bourbon by any means, and I didn't want to give that impression in the book. But there was, his story, which is a story of entrepreneurship and of empire and of capitalism. Really, he was sent over here trying to find crops that could be grown that would be profitable. He's part of the British Empire, and he's looking for a substitute for his beloved British, beer made out of malted barley. His eye falls to corn. And I was like, this unique, New World grain would ultimately become the base of what is the king of American spirits, of American whiskey, which is bourbon. All due respect to rye. And, I thought that was a great story, looking at the grain. And he did have a still. We don't know for sure if he actually distilled his corn beer into spirits. But there are indications that he did. He probably did, but we don't know for sure. And I thought that was an interesting story just to look at it from a business perspective. He was experimenting with wine. He was doing all kinds of experiments to find an alternative to the kind of things that the English were drinking in this new world. So he's adapting. It's a very American story.
He's trying to start the American party.
Right. And I wanted to use him. He was in Virginia. And I wanted to use him as an example of history being written by the winners because his name is forgotten largely. And also because we don't know for sure if he really, actually distilled this. He probably did. But he did have his eye on this grain. And it's a very murky origin story. And I like the fact that it was murky. I like the fact that it wasn't definite. That we couldn't say for sure that this is this, this is that. Which gets us into a common theme throughout the rest of American history, which is myth, the myth in marketing. I think the story quite often is more important than the actual liquid. I mean, that's what we're drinking. We're drinking something that we want to reflect some sort of truth about ourselves. I drink this brand. This is what it says about me. A lot of that is myth. It's storytelling. It's marketing. And there were elements of that in Thorpe's story. So that's why I open the book with that.
Mm-hmm. And even in the book, you do talk about those myths because there are, I don't want to dive into them, but there are certain brands that you see on the shelves that they don't actually represent what they say they represent, right? And you do a good job of pointing some of those out at the very beginning.
Yeah, and not to condemn them. I think that's also part of the beauty of the history of this. It's like there is so much myth. It's just storytelling. It's not necessarily real, but there's hucksterism is very much a part of it. And these brands today that have created these, outrageous, kind of fantastic stories, are also being very, very, they're honoring that tradition almost. They're in a way almost more authentic by, creating something because that's part of the story. Ever since the beginnings of modern marketing for bourbon, after the Civil War, you started to see producers do this, just kind of create these stories that have that appeal to us.
Mm-hmm.
So
I know I feel good about Elijah. When I drink Elijah Craig, I'm like, it came from a priest who accidentally burned his farm and sent burnt barrels down the river, and that's how we came bourbon.
It did, but it's like the Johnny Appleseed aspect of all of this. It's like we these myths, even though they might not be strictly literally true, do a lot of times reveal a larger truth about what we want to believe about ourselves and that kind of thing. So, looking at the history of this spirit, I also wanted to look at history itself and how we interpret it.
Well, cool. So let's jump ahead a little bit in history and let's get to, I don't want to say modern times, but more-ish modern times. There was a pretty culmination year of 1964 that you kind of talked about in your prologue. Can you talk about kind of what was happening during that time period?
Right. So in 1964, the story really starts more than a decade before 1964.
Please indulge. Teach me.
And the Korean War is, about to start, and producers, specifically, Louis Rosenstiel, who was one of the big four companies, controlled about 75% of the American whiskey industry, and they were looking at the shortages they had suffered during World War II when rations had been put in place, and a lot of them had converted over to produce industrial alcohol for the war, and there were great shortages during that time. And Rosenstiel sees the Korean War, and he thinks it's going to blow up, possibly come another world war. So, he goes and he starts producing full blast so he can get a lot of surplus, anticipating this coming drought. Well, the Korean War ends, and it didn't blow up into the, world war that he thought it might become. And so he's left with this huge surplus of whiskey, way more than what Americans are drinking. And Americans are drinking a lot. It was roughly 8 times national demand. And taxes were due on this product after 8 years. You could age, that was the bonding period. That's when your taxes became due. Well, as this tax crunch is coming forth, Rosenstiel is like, well, I'm going to lose my shirt when taxes come due on this product that I can't really sell. And he's going to have to start selling it for a loss. All the other producers are going to have to cut their prices and possibly start selling to compete with him. and it could ruin the industry. And the industry had been subject to a lot of these kind of boom and bust cycles in the late 1800s, which is why the industry back then had tried to form a cartel. There was a distiller, Joseph Greenhut, who headed up the Whiskey Trust. It was very similar in the way it operated to Standard Oil at the time. This is before the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so he goes to his counterparts in the main lobbying group, the DSI, and he says, we've got to push the bonnet. We've got to lobby to get the tax period pushed back. And they actually fight him on it. Although it was, arguably good for the product and it's good for the industry, they knew that it was, kind of turning his mistake into an advantage for him. He was ahead of them with aging these bourbons a little longer. They knew he was going to start, because his company, Shenley, had mentioned this in the trade papers, they knew he was going to start going for the luxury market, competing with Scotch, selling these older products as older products. And they wanted to have the law kind of caveated, saying he couldn't label his products as older in certain ways until they had time to catch up, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, they fought him on it. So he went off and formed a kind of rebel lobbying group called the Bourbon Institute. And they lobbied successfully for the Frand Act, which moved the bonding period from 8 years to 20 years. So producers could go, that long without having to pay taxes immediately on the product, which is, a win overall. Well, he still has this huge surplus. He's got this product. He's got to sell it. His company has to grow. And he starts looking at these overseas markets. That was a great place to expand. They wanted to start marketing bourbon overseas. There wasn't a huge market for it. People were buying Scotch in some places overseas, but, Scotch ruled the roost. They were going to go compete. And the 1964 resolution was so that, as we explained a little bit earlier, foreign producers couldn't produce something called bourbon and compete with them. It was to protect their product in these foreign markets. And so he lobbies Congress, the Bourbon Institute lobbies Congress, and gets this thing passed calling bourbon a distinctive product of the United States. And that's sort of where this resolution comes. And today it's been reimagined as, a much more... it's been kind of imagined as something different, something kind of like it was honoring this thing of American heritage. And I was like, but really it was a business move. It was a pretty cutthroat business move. Mm-hmm. And when you say, America's native spirit, what's that mean? And I was like, well, it's a business, and it's a business that represents a lot of American capitalism throughout history.
What was the result of the Bourbon Institute in the overseas market? I mean, was it a successful endeavor, or did it end up just having, no fruits of the labor were really found?
Well, you could argue that a lot of those fruits are seen today. You've got American whiskey expanding into overseas market. It's become particularly popular, especially in the UK, in a lot of other parts of Europe. Obviously, Japan, everyone knows about that. Australia, you're starting to see its reputation improve. When these companies were trying to expand in the 60s overseas, they struggled a little bit because people didn't really know what bourbon was. They didn't know how it was different than Scotch. They didn't know that, honestly, American whiskeys, the way they're aged, can go for a little bit less time than Scotch. And that's kind of where they'll find their sweet spot. People saw it as kind of blue collar. They saw it as like a very humble drink. They saw Scotch as, the drink of, that had accompanied the British, during their time of empire. So it was seen as like a gentleman's drink. It was seen as, the drink of the ruling class kind of. Whereas bourbon, quite honestly, and even in the U.S., was seen as, the drink of these guys, one-strapped overalls out in the mountain hollers, and it didn't always have the best reputation. And so, in the United States, you'd see it advertised a lot more often as kind of, blue-collar, working class, that kind of thing. But when companies were going overseas trying to advertise in the 60s, they would try to change that image, because a lot of this is in our heads. So Jim Beam, very specifically, and I look at this in the book, Jim Beam, which was not a huge company at the time, it was kind of mid-size in the 60s, they had a series of advertisements for overseas markets that had, classic Jim Beam white label, but you had these guys with, top hats on, they're wearing tuxedos, and it was billed, for this new audience as a luxury thing, so that it could compete with Scotch, which was seen as kind of as a fancier kind of drink. So that was an interesting story. That get back to another theme I like to explore in the book of, it's all in our minds. Like all these rules of connoisseurship, what's good, what's bad, if it's older versus if it's younger, that kind of stuff. A lot of it, when you're doing blind tastings, I think a lot of those rules get thrown out the window a little bit. You realize that it is kind of in our heads. It's kind of what's marketed to us.
Yeah, it's always one of those things. I mean, even when you bring a few friends over and you have a few bottles out, and then one of them says Van Winkle on it, then they immediately just drink it, and they're like, oh, it's so smooth. But then you put like Elijah Craig 12 next to it, they're like, well, they're both 12 years, like, but it's this whole concept of mind over matter and what you're actually drinking versus what do you think you're drinking.
Well, my father had a whole bunch of Pappy. He'd gotten kind of before Pappy became the big, hyped thing that it has become. Mm-hmm. And this was several years ago, and I told him, whenever someone brings up Pappy because they've heard about it, do me a favor, go ahead and just give them some, pour them a mini bottle or whatever and give it to them, and just record their responses for me. And he did, and some of them he would do blind, and that sort of stuff. So this was fun to watch. He was like, about half of them, when I let them know it's Pappy, all of a sudden the eyes roll back in their head, and it's like they've just enjoyed the nectar of the gods. And the other half of people just kind of look at it and are like, really, this is what the big fuss is about? And I think that goes a lot to, if you do it blind, it's like a lot of these, with craft whiskey. And I love seeing where craft whiskey is going. But, just to be fair, some of the worst stuff I've had is craft whiskey. But they have the image thing, some of these. Yeah. They've got the image thing down. Like, they're small, they're independent, but, it's overpriced and maybe underaged. And so they've got this asset in that an image that today has a lot of value out in the market, having a small facility and, these buzzwords like artisanal and craft, which don't mean anything. They're meaningless, but, that sells. And you're seeing, I think it would be mystifying to, the whiskey men of days gone by to see some of these products on the shelf today and see what they're selling for. And they'd be like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, I think it would really confuse them.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories from the book is how, there was a period in American history where industry was sort of seen as a good thing in food. Like, there's a great history of the frozen food movement in Clarence Birdseye. And he's freezing food, and he was a foodie, but not in a way we today would think of, someone like him, being a foodie. And you see in whiskey advertising up until, World War II, they would advertise their industrial nature in a lot of ways. Hiram Walker actually had a series of advertisements where they hired Thomas Hart Benton, the painter, to do them. And it looks almost like Industry on Parade or like, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times in a way. It's like these guys working at factories, and they were promoting our whiskey is consistent, those kinds of things, which if you look at before when what artisanal really meant in America in the late 1800s, when it meant like a lot of spoilage, it meant a lot of inconsistency. It didn't necessarily mean a good product. They were reacting to that. We always react to the conditions that we inherit. And they were reacting to that. So they were using, these things that today don't really sell very well, the idea of industry to sell their product. And today we're sort of reacting to the reverse of that. We're reacting to a lot of big industries, and a product becoming a little more homogenous. Yes, it might be consistent, and yes, the overall quality, might be very high, but it is just a few corporations owning this and sort of rubbing out a lot of the weird quirks that were in whiskey before, some of which were quite enjoyable and kind of fun. And so we're moving back to a period of sort of celebrating small and consistent, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And there are some great benefits to that. I also think there are some drawbacks to that, because with whiskey, it is an industrial product in a lot of ways. So economies of scale, it does matter.
Right.
So I thought that was fascinating. And to look at whiskey that way, I think is a lot more valuable, when we're talking of guides and these guides that are written about, whiskey, appreciating it in that way too, and understanding what it is from a technical perspective turns a lot of rules on its head.
One of my favorite business books is by Seth Godin. It's called All Marketers Are Liars, and they scratch it out and put storytellers. And it goes through the examples of like Volkswagen and Porsche. They're the same exact thing, but people tell themselves that Porsche is so much better and amazing because it's a a luxury item, and we do that with everything. It's funny. It just goes on in the whiskey industry as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I kind of like to. I'm almost in awe of that in a way. I kind of like to celebrate that. One of my favorite stories is wild turkey. If you look at how wild turkey is made, if you go to their facilities, it's not particularly romantic. I mean, it does look pretty industrial there. And I'm a big fan of wild turkey products. They have a relatively low barrel entry proof. They make their whiskey quite well. But you go there and there's computers everywhere, and no one wants to talk about how, computers, these things used as tools, if they're going to use them, to evaluate their cuts or whatever. People don't necessarily like to talk about how this is really an advantage. You wouldn't criticize a heart surgeon for using a computer to do his job better. And I look at this product, but the reputation Wild Turkey had 30, 40, 50 years ago, it really was kind of like a little down home, a little blue collar. When I mention how good of a product I think Wild Turkey often, can be, people are like, well, wait a minute, isn't that just kind of like, that's like kind of Bubba's drink, right? And you're like, if you look at it technically.
You shoot that at the bar.
Yeah, and I was like, and you see that changing today, especially with geeks. Geeks all know that, know what their line of products and know how it is. And I thought that's really interesting. It's all in our minds. There are products that have, that kind of shine a little brighter on the store shelves right now, and I don't think they're necessarily made as good as Wild Turkey products. But so I was like, that's something I loved exploring in the book, is the perceptions about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason its reputation suffered was when the industry cratered in the 60s and 70s. It was seen as an old man's drink and that kind of. But these companies were making it very well. It wasn't because the product itself wasn't living up to standards or wasn't up to snuff. It was just because people turned away from it. They saw it as an old man. They saw it as part of the past. They saw it as grandpa's drink, and they were turning to vodka or white wine. They were turning to these other drinks that, in a way, reflected, how the times were changing. And bourbon, American whiskey, just kind of got left behind, although the product itself was great. And that is part of the reason the prices were so cheap in the 80s and 90s. A lot of people like me got into it because I was like, this is a great product, and nobody wants it. Not because it's not good, but just because, it's like fashion. I like to look at brands the same way I look at fashions. Hemlines go up, hemlines go down. Lapels widen and lapels get, slimmer. It doesn't have to do with the actual thing itself. It just has to do with what we're thinking at the time about that thing. So I think that's always important to remember.
Yeah, it's the psyche that all brings it together.
Right.
So
right.
I want to kind of just take a right turn and kind of go back to some of the meat of the book and the history. So there's something that you said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit, and you said that Rosenstiel presided over vicious consolidation rounds that made distillers and brands extinct, but is also a part of the reason why many bourbons today taste as good as they do. So talk about like what did he do that actually makes it taste better? Because the one thing that comes immediately to my mind, and when I always think of like the Bottled and Bond Act, I think of E.H. Taylor. And he was the man that spearheaded that. And that's what stopped people putting arsenic and tobacco spit and all these other kind of things in the whiskey to give it color. So kind of talk about what Rosenstiel did to help do all this.
Right. Yeah, Rosenstiel obviously coming far after Taylor. And Taylor, I spent a lot of time on him in the book too, and with the labeling regulations that came after the Bottling and Bond Act. So when you look at what I described as vicious consolidation rounds, you had way more distilleries before Prohibition. And then Prohibition really winnows down that number. And then, the arc of this industry's history is one of, and I like to use the Hamilton versus Jefferson thing. Hamilton and being a champion of consolidation, it kind of Hamiltonianizes over its history. And to get to the point, around 2000, you've got, just a handful of companies operating about a dozen, different facilities, making 99% of all American whiskey. And Rosenstiel in the middle of the 20th century is a big part of that. I like to think of these brands, these distilleries, as a school of fish. And then you've got slightly larger fish eating them. And then you've got killer whales eating them. And so you get to the point where it's just a few companies controlling everything. And, all these brands that we see on the shelves today, a lot of the older ones, say like Old Overholt or whatever, were independent. And they were made in these distilleries that, did things a little bit differently than the distillery that was just down the street. They might have ground their grains, they might have been a little more coarse or a little more fine, which affects the flavor. They might have seasoned their barrel with a lot of these little differences, which led to nuance. Kind of the same way that radio stations of past decades, you'd have these little quirks and things from independent DJs all picking their own tunes instead of having, say, Clear Channel, pick the 10 songs that everyone in America is going to listen to. Mm-hmm. And as the industry consolidates, a lot of those little differences, got rubbed out of the system. And you can taste that when you taste through Dusty's today. Like, you get a much wider range of flavors in whiskey. And so American whiskey, it lost a lot, because of that. It also lost, I think, a lot of dead wood. I've had a lot of Dusties that are horrible, So, that's always, I think, useful and important to remember.
Yeah.
And Rosensteel, was a part of that. And it's not a very romantic side of the story. And in a lot of ways, it was a bad thing. There were a lot of really great producers that went out of business because the industry was consolidating. Guys like him are buying up these brands and they're batching their processes. They're all bringing it over, under consolidated roofs. But in a lot of ways, too, there is a benefit from that. When you look at, say, 10,000 distilleries in America, 200 years ago, every farmer has a still. They're not necessarily making a great product because they don't have economies of scale. They're not focusing all their attention on their craft. This is just a sideline to farming, basically. I wouldn't really want that. A whole bunch of tiny producers making a product that, they can't necessarily afford to age long enough, that kind of thing. But I also don't want just, 3 corporations making all of it, so it's all kind of homogenous. I think there's a happy middle ground. You look at the craft distilling boom today, and it's way over 500 distilleries. That's still kind of a lot. A lot of them, and they're struggling, and it's hard to raise all that kind of capital. But maybe a couple hundred. There you're getting a lot of variety, but these companies are also just big enough where they can afford the economies of scale to really make the product right.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of even what's going on today with InBev basically buying like every brewery that's out there.
Yeah. And so with Rosensteel, these vicious consolidation rounds, there were a lot of negatives that came off that. This kind of regional feel that whiskey once had, where you'd have distilleries all over the country instead of only in Tennessee and Kentucky for the most part. That was lost, and that it's kind of sad, to think about. But then you also have this man who is lobbying for the Ferrand Act, which pushed the bonding period from 8 years to 20 years, which gave distillers a little more room to experiment. Some of these oak bombs, these much older whiskeys, things like that. He also pushed for that resolution, 1964 resolution, which protected American whiskey in foreign markets to help raise its star a little bit. And so those are ultimately good things. But the story is ultimately gray, and it's not always black or white. So, that's what I mean when I talk about that. And that's why I like the story. He's not a great image, for marketing. He had links to organized crime, as I said, indicted but never convicted. He apparently bugged his office and would use it for blackmail purposes. So it's like he's not a very romantic figure, and he was kind of a titan. His office was in the Empire State Building.
Is that why you wouldn't see like a brand or a whiskey named after him today or something like that?
Oh yeah, sure. And I talked to people while doing the research, and a lot of people prefer to look at him as like a corporate raider. Like, oh, he just bought up brand. He wasn't a distiller. He did actually work in a distillery before Prohibition. He was from Cincinnati. His family had a distillery in Kentucky, and he worked there as a very young man. But they're like, well, he's not really a distiller. He's not a craftsman. He's just a businessman. He in the 60s, he donated $100 million to charity. That's how rich this guy was. It's a much bigger industry then relative to the U.S. economy than it is today, And I thought that was just a fascinating story. That's a real story in American history, warts and all. So,
well, good deal. So we're coming up to the end of this, and I kind of want to get back to the psyche and the marketing, and talk about one last thing that you mentioned, the prologue, and you talk about bourbon being a quote comfort food. So talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah. So I've been asked in a number of interviews, and I've seen a lot of other writers question so what's the reason for the comeback? American whiskey is way more popular now than it's been in a long time. And, people attribute that to, Mad Men and all that kind of stuff. And I look at it, I'm like, well, when you look at this spirit, it has a rich heritage. It's got a really fascinating, great history. And a lot of the symbols that you see on the labels, a lot of the iconography goes back to the frontier. And that's a magical, almost kind of like mythical time. We see that as, I think the frontier would have been a horrible place to live personally. It was, life expectancy was shorter.
A lot of dysentery.
But it is mythical. It's like, going west.
The Oregon Trail.
Grueling pace.
Yeah.
Right, but there is that appeal of it too, where it's like you're independent, you're going off to the frontier, you're forging something new, you're building a new life for yourself. That's what it represents, and we see that as that's kind of a bedrock for Americans in a lot of ways. The West and bourbon, which was kind of created by Western migration. American whiskey, there's a lot of rye used before, and as we move west into territories where corn is more predominant, you see that coming into the mash bills more, and so bourbon represents that in a lot of ways, symbolically and very quite literally, and it's represented in the labels. And so I think today, times are confusing, and everyone likes to say that their time is confusing, but today, it is. Economically, we've got a lot of disruption in the economy. You've got a lot of very brand new, shiny industries kind of tearing down the old ones, and they're leaving income inequality in their place and that sort of thing. And politics, you've got a system that is arguably more meritocratic than it has been in a long time. But you still have a lot of arguing going on in Washington, so it's confusing that way. I think socially, we're more connected than we ever have been through social media, but we're also more disconnected than we ever have been. You go into a bar today and you see crowds of people staring at their phones. In the book, I described the numb glow of tiny screens has replaced an actual conversation we're having with the human in front of us. And so I think that part of bourbon's resurgence is linked to, it is connected in a lot of ways to that past. And we see that past as simpler. And, in some ways, I think we want to return to it. And so bourbon is kind of comfort food. A lot of times, comfort food for people is something that you might have enjoyed as a kid, growing up, macaroni, what your mom cooked, that kind of thing. And we see this drink as a drink of the past, of our grandfathers and that kind of thing. And so we're returning to it for those sorts of nostalgic reasons. And there's a comfort in that. I also think that it's a little more simple than that, and what's old is new again, right? So the industry created in the 60s and 70s because it was seen as grandpa, as our father's drinks or whatever. But, we returned to it because we had, a lot of vodka before. People had adopted that because it was new and it was kind of shiny and it was a little risque. And then it kind of became boring. People are always looking to react a little bit. They're always looking to be a little different. And once bourbon was and American whiskey almost had left, once the industry had fallen so much, the return to it was kind of a way to be different. That's what brought me to it a little bit in the first place. It was different. I mean, I remember I would drink whiskey in bars with my friends for 15 years ago, and they kind of look at you like, why are you drinking that? And I kind of like that. There was an appeal to that. I felt like I was kind of striking out and doing something a little different. And I think the resurgence of American whiskey, you can link a little bit to that. It was, it was kind of a cool thing. It was a trendy thing. It became a trendy thing, but a lot of people were returning to it because it was cool again, because it had been forgotten. So that's what I mean when I call it a comfort food. Part of it's just the fashion aspect of it. What's old is new again. Henlem's go up, Henlem's go down. Whiskey was popular, then it's unpopular. Now it's popular again. In a deeper sense, that connection to the past that whiskey has, because it's had this influence on history. And we didn't really get into it, but the Whiskey Rebellion and the Whiskey Trust and whiskey in the 1800s, and we connect with that. That's why it's a comfort food.
Well, awesome. I mean, this was a great talk, and really into not only the history but the psychology of how we view a lot of these things. So, Reid, I just want to say thank you again for coming on the show. This was very fantastic.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Yeah.
This is always an interesting topic. Talk about a comfort food. And my friends now, I've been drinking bourbon forever because I'm from Bardstown.
Right, right.
You talk about a comfort food from the past. I was probably served it when I was a baby, to quit teething or something, but no, when we get around and friends and you drink the different brands and you talk about this one's different, this one, that, it does create that conversation around that, that bottle or whatever, rather than just all of us on Twitter seeing what's, the next juicy story or whatever.
Yeah, that's the fun stuff. I don't spend a whole lot of time on Twitter. I'm on it, but I love the occasional meeting group I'll have with other whiskey geeks, and everyone will maybe bring a bottle of something, and you're just kind of talking. You spend hours, in a room. Maybe there's a fireplace in the room. Who knows, right? That's the fun stuff, is debating this kind of stuff. Debating the geeky stuff too, and small barrels versus large and all that kind of stuff, the geek stuff. Like that's
exactly.
I feel like debating it is part of the fun, as long as you're, not out to draw blood. I never want to take it too seriously, where some people, you get the impression that they almost get angry, when they see prices go up or they see, and that's kind of sad in a way. Like I came to this because it was like a fun thing. It was kind of there's a lot of joy from it. So it's important to always keep that perspective too. You get the inevitable squabbles of groups that are really into something, be it comic books or Star Trek or whiskey. But I always try, it's important to keep that perspective that it's always supposed to be fun, never supposed to draw blood.
So if people want to get in touch with you and they want to buy your book, Bourbon Empire, how do they do it?
It's at most bookstores, and it's on Amazon. I've got a website. It's just by name.com. If they want to get in touch with me, my email's on there. I
was throwing you a softball. I figured it was on Amazon and all the other retail outlets that you could possibly think. So, well, awesome. So again, thank you for being on the show. If you like what you hear, make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Bourbon Pursuit. And if you have any suggestions for new shows, new guests, we're always open to hear. So, Reid, thank you again for being on the show, and we'll see you all next time. This episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast is brought to you in partnership with thewhiskeywash.com, a lifestyle website for news and reviews for people who like whiskey and for those who think that a life without whiskey has no style. Thewhiskeywash.com.